This is Mack Jones, and I'm interviewing Mrs. Ruth Ann Jordan of Fort Reno, Oklahoma.
I come from a long line of Army people. My grandfather came from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and brought his family here. My father was then 12 years of age. He remained at Fort Reno to become an adult and serve in the Army of his country for 32 years, 4 months, and 18 days. He retired there and moved to El Reno, where he remained for the rest of his life, passing away on August the 30th, 1967. I was born at Fort Reno and also have a brother that was born there. I lived there my entire life until I met and married my husband, Marvin A. Jordan, who was a soldier there. We have one son, Kenneth Jordan, who is now a major in the Army, and he and my nephew are really the fourth generation of our family to serve their country. He was born in El Reno because Fort Reno didn't have facilities for childbirth. They had a hospital, but we came into town to have our children. We remained there until World War II, and my husband had risen from the rank of a private to a second lieutenant, having attended the first officer's candidate school in Philadelphia. We went to San Antonio, Texas, and when Pearl Harbor was bombed, he volunteered for overseas service. He spent 2 years overseas, then returned to the States. We joined him and had many happy years traveling over the country. He retired as a full colonel in 1963. We returned to El Reno and made this our home. He passed away on the 9th September of 1967. My son attended Virginia Military Institute and was commissioned a second lieutenant. He went on to become a major and is now teaching there. He teaches ROTC, the Armored Branch. He has 2 daughters, Sharon and Kirsten, and is married to the former Pam Howard of Mission, Kansas. I have many happy memories of Fort Reno. It was an ideal place to be brought up because you had everything. You had horses to ride, you had a swimming pool. I attended school the first 2 years under Mrs. J.L. Patman. My brother also attended school there. Since my father was a resident of the state, and his father had retired and moved to El Reno, we were considered residents of El Reno. So when the problem arose of not being able to keep a school at Fort Reno, the children that had attended there were sent to Darlington School. But we were brought into El Reno and attended school here, and we both graduated from El Reno High School. My father, my aunt, and uncle also attended this same school at Fort Reno, and in those days, you didn't have regular teachers. The people who had a little education were the ones that taught the troops, and in turn, the children of the military that were stationed there were also taught. So a child in the first grade might be handed a 5th grade reader or a 3rd grade reader, whatever happened to be their turn to pick up. But it was just a one-room school building, but they seemed to learn so much more because they listened to what the other children were saying, and they retained what they did learn. Fort Reno was famous in this part of Oklahoma for the polo games and the Indian powwows. These people would come there and spend 2 or 3 weeks. Of course, cattle had always been raised there, and they were butchered and rationed out to the Indians. They'd have races, and Major Weeks in particular was a very avid fan of polo and having the Indians there. So many people recall these when the powwows that we are now having are attended. We had other things to happen. My mother took charge of the Christmas program every year, and she'd start in September to make Christmas stockings so that every child at Fort Reno, the civilian employees as well, their children received gifts at the old post hall. And she made an effort to contact each parent to make sure that that child received the particular gift that they wanted. And in those days, if you received 1 or 2 presents, you were mighty lucky. And I have people to this day tell me that that was the highlight of their childhood, to come to Fort Reno and being presented that one gift and that sack of candy. And we had a Mr. Smith, Sergeant Bud Smith, that made an ideal Santa Claus, and also a Bosco Smith. They all knew these children, so by that they could call them by name, and they could recall things and ask them about their families, which made it seem so real to the children. Well, after the post hall was torn down, then they moved the Christmas programs to the outside, and it was held in front of the old barracks under a huge Christmas tree. This Christmas tree still stands there, but many things have been torn down. The house that I was born in is no longer there. The one my brother was born in is still there. And my father worked as a civilian there for many years before the Quartermaster Corps was founded, and the day that it was, they lined the men up, and very much as with the school books, it was according to where you were standing what your rank was. The first 4 or 5 men would be sergeants, the next would be corporals. My father was a private, but he was made a corporal the next day, so he was held that rank for a number of years, and later he was promoted to a sergeant, and he drew $90 a month for a long, long time, which was top for a staff sergeant. He later went on to become a technical sergeant. Then he became a master sergeant, and that was the rank he held when he retired. And with all the hash marks he had up and down his arm, the inspecting officers that would come there from Washington just couldn't believe that anyone had been one place for so long. And he had the pleasure of serving under General Marshall, General Murtaugh. And I have a personal letter from General Marshall that was written to my dad just shortly before he passed away. Dad had sent him a get well card, and in return he wrote to him addressing him, Dear Mike. And it's these things that really make memories of Fort Reno such a pleasure. And we have, for the past 7 years or so, held a reunion. It's on the last Sunday of June, and people come from all over the United States to attend these. We have a gab fest at Adams Park on Saturday evening, and many who cannot be there on Sunday turn out for that. Then we have a basket lunch. We used to meet in front of the old commissary, but due to the fact that there are so many flies and the smell of the stables, we have moved into the chapel. And Mr. Stephen is a very gracious host. He always enters into this wholeheartedly, and we are made very welcome. And of course, each year, different people return, and many of us attend them each year and haven't missed any. I had to miss 2. And it's a real joy to go there. This chapel was built by the prisoner of war labor. We had these men there during the wartime, and my father, being head of the farm barn, had many of them work for him. Had both Italians and Germans. Many of these men had been in the United States and had returned to Germany when the war was declared, so then they had to fight for their country. But they really didn't want to, because they knew what a great country we had. And they listened to the news and read the newspapers, and really were very much opposed to having, I think some of them surrendered just to get them back home, really. And we now have, as part of the Fort Reno Cemetery, a section that is just for them. Their own people built this wall, and of these people, only one man actually died at Fort Reno. He had been working in the service club, and gas is a dangerous thing. He lit the match, then lit the gas, or lit the gas and then lit the match. So he met his doom. But the other men were sent in from the various PW camps in this part of the country. And they have liaison officers at Fort Sill who come up here each year to honor these people. When my dad was alive, they always asked him to accompany them, because he could tell them different things that had happened with the PWs. The PW camp was on the Fort Reno Reservation. It is no longer there. All it stands now is just a silo, I believe, or a water tank. It was rumored that the buildings that were left standing there were going to be renovated, and this would be opened up again, but there is nothing there, so it was a false rumor. And part of the Fort Reno Reservation was turned over to the federal government, to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and that is where the El Reno Reformatory is. Want to cut it off?
Now I want to ask you something else. When you were real young and the Indians showed up for their powwows or what have you, were you youngsters afraid of them, or did they treat you nice, or can you tell me something about it? Or?
They were very friendly. Of course, this was a long time after the warpath ended, of course, because I was born in 1917. And as a child, we danced with these Indians, and my mother would get out and dance with them. And of course, they were very anxious to come to Fort Reno because they really had good rations. And I was reminiscing with someone a while ago, and rations today are being issued uptown to the Indians that are now attending a powwow that starts tonight and will run through Sunday. And they were very friendly Indians, and appreciated the white people getting out and dancing with them.
I'm sure of that. What I was thinking about being a youngster, I don't know. I think when I was a youngster, I was scared. You said Indian, that was a bad word. But of course, you were raised with them. You didn't know any better.
Well, living close to Concho and to Darlington. Of course, Darlington was an Indian agency, and I was taken there as a child because friends of ours ran a store over there, Mr. Monkoff. And then later they moved to Concho and had a little store there where all the Indians came over to this little store to purchase their needs. So, as you say, we were in contact with the Indians. We had no Indian blood in us, but some of my relatives had married girls who have Indian blood, and of course they're very proud of this.
Well, I'm glad that everyone didn't have the ideas that those of us that were never around Indians in our youth. All we knew was what we read, and this sometimes wasn't too good.
That's so true. Mr. Packer, Mr. Packer, who came and talked with my father a lot, has done a lot of research on Indians, and we feel like they were very cruel to our people, but our people in turn, in most instances, were the ones that were cruel to them, and that was the only way they had of getting back. And he brings this out in an article that he did on my father, which came out in the Gun Digest. And there is a copy here in the Historical Society about it. And I also have a letter that was written, it's my grandfather's history. And in there he tells about times that when the Indians were on the warpath, and the 4th Cavalry was to go out against the Kiowas and the Comanches, and of course they were on the warpath, and they finally caught up with them in Texas, and he said they spent about 6 days watching, just waiting to see what the Indians would do, and this was with General McKenzie, and they went out and had all the officers to come in, and they made their plans for a night attack on the Indian camp. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, the cavalry and the 4th Company of the infantry and 2 mountain howitzers and a detachment of field artillery started out to find the Indian camp. And they were guided by 4 Tonkawa Indians and their head chief, and his name was Tonkawa Charlie. And they had some squaws, and they went along too. I guess we took them along as cooks is probably what their purpose was. And my grandfather said he presumed that it was their wives. And of course the Indians themselves were in the employ of the government as scouts, and they knew every part of the state plains thoroughly, and they didn't care for the Kiowas and Comanches. In fact, they were bitter enemies, because these tribes had almost wiped out the Tonkawas in 1874. So they were out to get their revenge. And just previous to starting out, the company commanders issued strict orders to their men that as soon as the command march was given, not a word was to be spoken by anyone. No lights of any kind were to be used. Darkness and perfect silence prevailed for about an hour and 30 minutes. And so by that time, old Charlie had located the campfire and their camp, and he had Mackenzie had 4 men go out and see just what they could see, and he says they were taking the sleep of the just. So he sent his adjutant and his aide-de-camp and told them in a whisper to report to the general at the head of the column. So they whispered to each other and kept as silent as possible. And when the bugle sounded, that was the time that they were to charge. and he didn't want any prisoners. He wanted no prisoners except the women and children, and that's all they took, 5 women and 8 children. And in 20 minutes, there was not an Indian to be seen. But most of them had their ponies staked out, and they ran to them, and as soon as the bugle sounded, and they took off. And cut it off just a minute. But we were victorious because the only casualty in among our people was the bugler, and he was shot in the right breast and through his right lung, but he lived. And then after mutual congratulations, the troops gathered up everything that the Indians had left and destroyed it. And then they just made a big pile and set fire to it, and what the fire didn't destroy, such as the camp kettles and other things, were cut up with axes and so forth. But the worst discussion was when they got back to their own camp. And Mackenzie and his camp attack plan detailed 2 companies of his own regiment of the 4th Cavalry with their officers to stampede the Indians' herd. And there were about 1,800 head in this. And they were to drive them on the run straight to their own camp, where they'd be corralled until the troops came back. The plan was entirely successful, and the stock was headed for our camp and on the full run. An orderly was sent to Mackenzie to inform him of the success of the plan, and he sure was pleased to hear it. And then the 2 companies and the herd arrived about break of day, and they got in about 9 o'clock and were dismissed. And then Mackenzie told his adjutant to detail 2 companies of the reserve, the people who hadn't gone, to lead the animals out to a level place about 500 yards from the camp. The 2nd company shot each animal as soon as it arrived. By sundown, they were all shot. Between 17 and 1,800 are the finest stock that anyone would ever want to see. And there were work animals and ponies and brood mares and their colts and a lot of fine mules, but every one of them was killed. It was a shame to have to do this because previous to this expedition, General Mackenzie was on another expedition of the same kind, and he raided the Indian camp and got most of their animals and drove or scattered the Indians, but they met together and reorganized and caught up all the stock they could find. And sometime that night they tried to raid Mackenzie's camp, but they were driven off. However, they managed to stampede the stock, their own and about 40 of the cavalry's horses. And he said he believed Mack did some tall swim, but when he peeled off, he firmly restored resolve that he would never give them the chance to do so again. And that's why he had all the stock killed as soon as possible. An Indian is a warrior when mounted, but on foot is as helpless as a babe. All those who escaped made their way somehow back to Fort Sill Reservation, from which they started to go on the warpath, and surrendered themselves as prisoners of war. That was about 50 years ago, and they have never been on the warpath since. Of course, this document was written by my grandfather back prior to 1924, so it is a good many years ago now. And the expedition put the fear of God and the plans of the white man in the Indians' heart. And anyhow, the Comanches and Kiowa Indians have ceased to be a terror to the settlers of Texas. And